in our politics, but across the world, really.
I think Sean's right on some of that, and all of it actually, and part of it comes down to epistemology, the study of how we know. And one of the paradoxes of science is it by nature raises questions, and it raises some profound questions like when does life begin, like a host of other things. And on top of that, it changes the pace of change. I mean, we're all happy to have our iPads, but that's a challenge. The whole pace of change thing and how we deal with that becomes an epistemological issue. And so I've come to believe, based on my time in Congress, that I no longer really see the divide as Republican Democrat so much as I see the divide as people I can reason with and people I can't. And there are people I can't reason with on the left, and there are people I can't reason with on the right. And by reason, I don't mean we necessarily agree on our conclusions. I mean the process by which we gather information. To me, that when I said science is in my DNA, it's in my DNA to reason, to gather evidence. I used to sit around the table with my dad, and we'd have these heated arguments. And to his immense credit and my eternal gratitude, he could be advocating a point, and I would present something to him, and he would say, you know, son, that's a very good point, I'm going to have to reconsider. Bam! Can you imagine that? Instead of immediately being threatened by that and turning the tables or trying to
rank,
or pulling rank or any other thing he could do, he took a piece of evidence and a piece of reasoning, and he said, I hadn't thought of it that way. That is so difficult in politics. You're a flip-flopper. I had a debate where someone pointed out a legitimate flaw in the legislation I was advocating, and I acknowledged it on the floor of the House. It became a subject for attack and opprobrium. Even the author of the bill admits it's not perfect. Right, because most of the bills we pass in Congress are perfect. But that process, which should be intrinsic to who you are as scientists and human beings, and should be intrinsic to a constitutional democratic republic, and I like to believe was for Jefferson, preach a crusade against ignorance. Establish the law for educating the common man. Because the price you pay to do this will be a pittance of what you would pay if the people are left in ignorance and priests and kings rise up as leaders. Basically, that's the paraphrase. That's from Jefferson. Now, the other thing I think is really important is science is a merit-based enterprise. And I mention that for two reasons. If you're a seniority-based or a power-based enterprise, science can be threatening to that. And I also mention it because on the global scale, I spent a lot of time on science diplomacy, the idea that we can use our scientific acumen and resources to help promote diplomatic efforts. And I traveled around the world addressing this, and it's worth thinking about. When I talk to foreign scientists, they were not predominantly interested, especially the young, energetic folks, most of whom got their degrees, or many from here, from somewhere in our country. They didn't say, send me money. You know what their biggest frustration was? That they didn't live in meritocracies. That their academic environment was based on who you knew, whose family you were from, what your caste was, etc. We are really fortunate as academics and as Americans to live in a largely merit-based society. And I think one of my concerns is the merit of the argument is starting to take less power in our political world than the argument based on power.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. Can I expound on that a little bit?
Go for it.
Part of what I'm sure that Brian has run into a lot is the role of the media in all of this. And something happened in the 1960s and 1970s called postmodernism. And it grew up in university systems, in humanities departments. And there was a great confluence between postmodernism and the civil rights movement. And essentially postmodernism said that science is just one way of knowing, and its truth is no more true than any other way of knowing. Science is the way of knowing of Western white men, is the way that it was portrayed at that point in time. But, and essentially was applying cultural relativism or cultural anthropology to all cultures around the world. And this flowed well with the civil rights movement in that I, as a white man, could not claim that I had any greater access to the truth than a woman, than an Asian man, than a black woman, than a gay man or woman. So all this political identification became the arbiter of what was true. Science doesn't work that way. And, you know, John Locke, back to epistemology, you know, defined what, way back, you know, hundreds of years ago, defined what knowledge was and how it was separate from political identity, opinion, and belief. And that's the thinking that Jefferson actually based his ideas of democracy on. And it was very important because different factors of facets of Puritanism were arguing with each other about who was closer to God. And Locke figured out a way to identify, based on empiricism, how we could tell the difference, what was true. With science, we are basing our arguments on nature. And there is no postmodernist reality that works for that. It is separate from each of us as individuals. And it has nothing to do with our political identity. In journalism schools and in education schools, postmodernism is still taught. I still see reporter guidelines for major newspapers that say there is no such thing as objectivity. Well, if you believe that, then you're not going to dig to get at the objective truth. And this has profound consequences. People like David Gregory, the NBC White House news chief during the run-up to the war in Iraq, was asked afterwards, how come none of you guys in the White House press corps ever pushed the administration about the lack of any real credible evidence for WMD and all the stuff about the, you know, yellow cake uranium, and why we couldn't come up with any evidence to support an invasion? And he said, and this was after it became clear that there really had been no evidence, and this was kind of a trumped up case, and everybody was either lost in the fog of war or they just wanted to go to war. And he said, I respectfully disagree. It's not our job. Well,
really?
Yeah.
David Gregory said that.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Wow.
So if it's not their job as the media to hold government accountable to standards of evidence, how is democracy going to function? So this problem is prevalent throughout, and now it's called false balance. We've got a name for it. It's the equation of knowledge with opinion, where you'll have you know, a news report put on the split screen, and you'll have a scientist on there. Climate change is a great example since it's so politicized right now. And that scientist will be talking about science, making a knowledge-based argument based on billions of data points accumulated over 50 years, over thousands of experiments. And then they'll put somebody else on the other side who will have an opinion. And they'll treat them as if they are equal points of view. And this is a problem probably because most people in journalism, their last science class was high school chemistry. And they went into English after that because they hated it. They assume that nobody else likes it. And they don't understand that this is an issue. So, anyway, that's my preaching
That was a
about
fun
that.
riff. Let's have someone else ask a question. Yeah. I'm sorry, I moderated.
No, that was good. No.
Hi, guys. All right, wonderful. Just
Hold the
Keep
mic
it up-
close.
Keep it up.
oh, right, okay. I just have a few questions on about how many times do you think during the upcoming debates within the next year or so, how many times are we going to hear people talk about genetics and use genetics incorrectly, or the word genetics and genomics and so on? How many times are these types of buzzwords going to come up in a presidential debate in the future?
I don't understand the question. What's behind the question? Help us understand.
Oh, I'm just saying it's kind of, it's going to represent the future of medicine, so I was just curious, between Barack Obama and his stance on genetics, genomics, and its role in medicine and so on, how often are the moderators in these types of debates going to even bring that up?
Probably never. You know, on that front, you know, look, give Romney his financial background. He is a bright guy, and he has studied, you know, just the investment potential for genetic-related research. I'm sure he's got that on his radar screen, maybe invests in it. So he's not a foolish person on that by any means. The question, and obviously Obama's not either, a brilliant guy in his own right, and if you look at the science budgets, There's a difference. And one of the questions is, are we going to go forward on this? And you've got the whole issue of stem cell, et cetera, and to what extent will the current, the fundamental, I think if you boiled it down to two issues. One, to what extent are fiscal constraints going to limit our investments in research that could drive the economy and make transformative changes for the country's future for generations to come? That's one. And along with that, to what extent will ideological constraints, be it ideology based on religious ideology or political ideology or simple economic ideology, i.e., my voters get their income from petroleum, and therefore I don't want the breakthrough change that would have decentralized power, even if that would be good for the country. I think those are the two key questions of the presidential election. Now, I think I said earlier, and I think Sean offered a good correction to it. I said earlier, I don't think science would play a major role. I actually believe that it is a weakness for the Republican Party used to have brilliant stalwarts in the center, people like Dan Evans and many others who were science-based, intellectual giants, objective, reasonable people. I think it's possible politically to make this an issue, to say, look, you don't really want our country to go down this path. You don't really want America, which is what it is today in all its greatness, because of our science and technological development. You don't really want us to go down this anti-intellectual path. That doesn't mean we waste money. It doesn't mean we just throw money at science. But look at the dang space program, for goodness sakes. We're dependent on Russian or private vessels, private ships to take us to our space station. We are renting a Russian ship. We just finished renting a Russian ship to break in at McMurdo Sound, a Russian icebreaker, because we got no icebreakers, no heavy icebreakers. I think there's a possibility to say to America, look, what happened to us in 1956 when Sputnik went up? We rallied as a country, we invested in science education, and that is why we are where we are today. If we had fled into superstition and dogmatism, it would have had a much different outcome. I actually think there's political potential. I'd love to take the fight if I were running. I'm thankfully not running, but you can see that there's a little bit of fire still left in me.